For 30 years, The Tonight Show ran like clockwork. The curtain would part, Johnny Carson would walk to his mark, run through his monologue, and settle behind the desk for what felt like the most dependable ritual on American television. But according to people who worked behind the scenes during that era, the calm on camera masked a much messier reality waiting in the wings. Carson, by several accounts, could size up a guest's condition almost instantly, whether they'd had a drink, smoked something, or taken something stronger, and adjust his handling of them accordingly. Staffers reportedly developed subtle backstage signals. A touch of the tie, cards squared twice, small cues meant to warn the crew that a guest might not be entirely steady. The environment that produced this was, by most descriptions, the green room, stocked of a well-regarded bar that Carson himself was said to have approved, and, if the era's looser culture is any guide, sometimes more than alcohol. Appearing on the show was an enormous opportunity and an equally enormous source of nerves. A strong showing could make a career. A weak one could follow a performer for years. Because Carson preferred loose, unrehearsed conversation rather than tightly scripted bits, many guests apparently felt that pressure acutely, and some responded by taking the edge off before walking out. The show, in this telling, wasn't immune to the broader culture of the 1970s and early 1980s, an era when recreational substance use was widespread across entertainment and beyond, and Carson supposedly developed a flexible, almost intuitive way of adjusting his interviewing style, depending on how affected a guest seemed, simplifying questions or gently steering the conversation when needed. George Carlin is remembered as something of a special case, as his comedy shifted from clean-cut to countercultural in the early 70s. So did his public presentation, and by most accounts he made no real effort to hide his cannabis use during his more than 130 appearances on the show. Despite the frequency of his visits and Carson's evident respect for his talent, Carlin was reportedly never asked to guest host, a distinction extended to many other comedians of the era, with the suggestion being that Carson didn't fully trust him to carry a full broadcast. Still, within the format of a normal interview, Carlin's loose, expansive state seemed to work in his favor. Carson would toss him a topic and let him run, producing free associative riffs that colleagues later described as some of his best material. Carlin himself would eventually acknowledge as much in his memoir, essentially confirming that his TV appearances during that period reflected the era and his own habits. Richard Pryor's appearances told a more volatile story. Widely regarded as brilliant and mercurial in roughly equal measure, Pryor could reportedly begin a segment as the funniest person in the room and then drift mid-sentence into something disjointed or distracted. One 1978 appearance is remembered for exactly that arc. Pryor discussing his current projects before a story dissolved into a string of loosely connected thoughts, leaving the audience unsure whether it was intentional. In moments like these, Carson is described as shifting into a kind of protective mode, redirecting with a quick question, defusing the tension with a joke, and moving smoothly to commercial rather than letting an awkward moment linger. People close to the show characterized Carson's attitude toward Pryor as genuine affection paired with real worry, a host who wasn't interested in moralizing about the comedian's well-documented struggles with cocaine, but who quietly checked in on him through mutual friends after rough nights on set. Truman Capote's January 1980 appearance is remembered as the clearest example of Carson's patience running out. Unlike Carlin or Pryor, whose altered states could still produce entertaining television, Capote reportedly arrived barely able to speak, slurring so badly that the control room leaned heavily on cutaways to Carson simply to keep the segment watchable. Where Carson had adapted with humor to other impaired guests, this appearance is described as visibly straining even his composure, a tightened smile, simplified questions, an obvious effort to get through the segment intact. Off camera, he was said to be furious, telling staff flatly that Capote wouldn't be invited back. The distinction people who worked on the show draws between a guest who was loosened up but still functional and one who was essentially incapacitated. Capote, in this account, fell clearly into the second category, and the incident reportedly led to tighter monitoring of guests before airtime and more careful oversight of the green room bar. Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong occupy a different category entirely, since their public image was built almost entirely around cannabis culture, and nobody involved seemed to be pretending otherwise. Rather than working around their state, Carson reportedly leaned into it, playing an exaggerated straight man to their stoner persona, feigning confusion at drug references, letting Chong's rambling anecdotes about their film Up in Smoke unspool without interruption, occasionally shooting the camera a knowing look. The dynamic is remembered less as Carson tolerating impairment, and more as him authenticating the duo's brand for a national audience, reflecting his broader belief that his job was to let guests be recognizably themselves on camera. Peter Fonda's 1970 appearance is recalled as one of the strangest in the show's history. Fonda, already known for Easy Rider and outspoken about psychedelics, arrived seemingly under the influence of something considerably stronger than a nightcap. Witnesses described dilated pupils, a guest who seemed to drift in and out of the conversation, and a monologue about how time doesn't move in a straight line so much as wrap around us, a response to a fairly ordinary question about upcoming projects. Carson reportedly recognized what was happening almost immediately and shifted into damage control mode. Simple questions and neutral expression, and a prearranged signal to cut to commercial early, roughly 5 minutes into what had been planned as a 12-minute segment. When the show returned from break, Fonda had quietly been swapped out for the next guest, and Carson carried on as if nothing unusual had happened, reportedly telling producers afterward that everyone has an off night and that Fonda should get another shot down the line, which he apparently did. Oliver Reed's 1975 appearance moved in a different, less comic direction. Known in Britain for a hard living, Reed is remembered as arriving visibly intoxicated and growing steadily more agitated as the interview went on, interrupting, shouting non sequiturs, and at one point standing up to demonstrate a fighting stance, which reportedly brought security noticeably closer to the stage. Carson's response here is described as markedly different from his handling of Carlin or Pryor. Less playing along, more firm redirection, and a segment cut significantly short. The line, according to people who worked with him, was aggression. Carson could work with someone who was stoned or a little drunk, but hostility or unpredictability of a threatening kind was where his tolerance stopped. Reed reportedly wasn't invited back. Sammy Davis Jr.'s 1974 appearance generated a different kind of speculation, not around a visible disaster, but around persistent rumors of what was fueling his unusually manic energy that night. Davis was already a favorite guest, and by most accounts his charm and stagecraft never wavered, but those who were there described a performer talking rapidly, unable to sit still, and visibly sweating under the lights more than usual. The kind of behavior industry insiders at the time associated with cocaine, which had become increasingly common in entertainment circles by the mid-1970s. Carson reportedly never addressed it directly, on air or off, though he apparently made a wry comment about feeling secondhand exhaustion once they cut to commercial. What set the appearance apart in this account is that Davis's professionalism never slipped. Whatever was or wasn't behind the extra energy, the segment played, by most measures, as good television. Taken together, these accounts describe a host navigating enormous cultural change in real time. Attitudes toward recreational substances shifted dramatically between the start of Carson's run in 1962 and the height of the permissive 70s, and it reportedly developed something close to an informal scale for how he handled it. A guest who was loose but could still deliver was fine. A guest who was incoherent or non-functional was a genuine problem, regardless of who they were. People who worked with him described someone who wasn't interested in moralizing about what guests did before they walked out, only whether they could still hold up their end of a broadcast, and who, when they couldn't, tended to work harder to give them a soft landing rather than use the moment for cheap laughs. His patience reportedly had firm limits, though aggression, disrespect toward the audience, or simply wasting airtime were treated as unforgivable regardless of a guest's stature. It's worth noting how differently these moments would likely play out today. In an age before social media, a wobbly or visibly altered appearance could be smoothed over, joked past, or quietly forgotten rather than replayed endlessly online, and Carson's own read on an incident often shaped how it was remembered by the public, since there was no ongoing public debate to contend with. Several of the guests involved reportedly expressed private gratitude later on for how he'd steered them through difficult nights rather than exploiting them for a bigger reaction. Whether or not every detail of these stories is precisely accurate, most of what's known comes from the recollections of people who worked on the show decades ago rather than from any on-the-record confirmation by Carson or his guests. The broader picture they paint is consistent. A host whose primary instinct, whatever was happening backstage, was to protect the show and the person sitting across from him and to make sure that, one way or another, the audience still got a good hour of television